On the 24th of April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks roared into Saigon as resistance to the communist invasion collapsed. US helicopters ferried the last remaining American diplomats and military advisors from makeshift helipads in the embassy grounds, and South Vietnamese civilians who had worked for the US forces rushed to leave if they could. Thousands were left behind, at the mercy of their new masters. On board the carriers which were standing off the Vietnamese coast, the lucky refugees were unloaded. And the helicopters ditched to make room for more landings. It was a shattering end to 15 years of American attempts to contain communism by direct action in Southeast Asia. Only a week earlier, another US ambassador had symbolically carried the stars and stripes on board one of the last helicopters out of his embassy as well. Almost overshadowed by these dramatic events, another pro-Western government in the area had also been overrun. Communist guerrillas of the Khmer Rouge seized Cambodia's capital, Phnom Penh, on the 17th of April. Immediately, they began a bloody revenge on their opponents. The Khmer Rouge leader, Pol Pot, announced that Cambodia was to be saved from Western decadence by being turned back into an agrarian society. Over the next 4 years, a nightmare experiment to create a workers' utopia was to be conducted on the Cambodian people. Their cities and towns were emptied and left to decay. The population was herded to forced labor in the fields. Thousands were to die of malnutrition and brutal treatment. The country was cut off from the outside world. The middle classes, intellectuals, and anyone who showed the slightest lack of enthusiasm for the actions of the Khmer Rouge were tortured and slaughtered in vast death camps. By most estimates, at least 1 million of Cambodia's population of some 8 million were to be killed, and a similar number flee the country before the Khmer Rouge were driven out. This tragedy took place in a country which had for years seemed a haven of peace and calm amid the turmoil of post-colonial Southeast Asia. But its roots lie deep in that colonial history and its aftermath. By the end of the 19th century, the Kingdom of Cambodia had become an integral part of the French Empire within the Union of Indochina. The country retained its own king, but his powers were nominal, and French influence was everywhere, in the administration, law, and economic life. Ambitious young Cambodians received a French-style education and went to France for university or technical training. French language and culture were everywhere. Inevitably, some young Cambodians were affected by anti-colonial ideas, particularly of Marxism, and there were sporadic anti-French demonstrations. But little was achieved before the French collapse in 1940 and the country's surrender to the Germans. Cambodia remained officially part of the Vichy regime. But in reality, once Germany's ally Japan had thrown the British and Dutch out of much of their Far Eastern empires in early 1942, the country was occupied by them. The humiliation of the former colonial powers had a profound effect on the attitude of the local population to their colonial rulers. The defeat of Japan brought a restoration of French power throughout Indochina and the beginning of a long guerrilla war against it. This was centered in what would become Vietnam and led by Ho Chi Minh, who had worked in Paris for some time and become an ardent communist. In Cambodia, a similar but less effective movement began under a shadowy figure named Pol Pot. Under its wily ruler, Prince Sihanouk, who had been crowned king in 1941, Cambodia remained relatively unaffected by this struggle and was rewarded with self-government within the French Union in 1949. In 1953, with the French war against Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh going badly, Cambodia received its independence. King Sihanouk abdicated in 1955, but was elected head of state. The following year, French troops were catastrophically defeated at Dien Bien Phu. France withdrew, leaving Ho Chi Minh's communists in control north of the 17th parallel and a non-communist regime in the south. Civil war between the two parts of Vietnam now ensued, with the United States becoming increasingly involved. In 1961, the first US advisors and military supplies were sent to the southern government. Gradually, the number of US troops was built up, and they began to play a more active role, until by 1965, US forces were undertaking much of the fighting. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which 2 US destroyers were attacked by North Vietnamese gunboats, the US began direct aerial strikes against North Vietnam. This swiftly developed into one of the most massive airborne assaults ever undertaken, with mighty B-52 bombers joining a wide range of aircraft in pounding targets in the north. Inevitably, this massive war spilled over into Cambodia. North Vietnamese forces used supply lines through her territory, and the Viet Cong guerrillas set up bases from which to operate within South Vietnam. Prince Sihanouk preferred to turn a blind eye despite South Vietnamese and US complaints. In retaliation, their air forces regularly attacked the supply routes through his country. Finally, on the 18th of March 1970, the tension led to a coup against Prince Sihanouk while he was on a visit to Moscow. This was masterminded by his pro-Western Prime Minister, Lon Nol. But despite the arrival of this more sympathetic regime, in the following month, US and South Vietnamese forces mounted a massive incursion into Cambodia to root out the Viet Cong. This had only limited effect, but served to increase sympathy within Cambodia for the country's own communist guerrilla movement. It was to the Khmer Rouge and its leader, Pol Pot, that Prince Sihanouk turned to overthrow the increasingly pro-American regime of Lon Nol. With Chinese and Russian backing over the next 5 years, the Khmer Rouge waged an increasingly effective war against Cambodian government forces. They steadily increased their control over territory outside the main cities. Desperate to get out of its Vietnamese entanglement, the United States carefully avoided any commitment of troops on the ground, but its air power devastated much of Cambodia. Steadily, US ground forces were withdrawn from South Vietnam, and responsibility for the war left to local forces. The result was a steady military collapse, as the Viet Cong strengthened their hold over all areas of the countryside which could not be sustained by air power. In Cambodia, hatred of the pro-Western regime was such that it too steadily lost ground during 1973 and 74. Khmer Rouge attacks became ever bolder and edged closer to the main cities. The writing was clearly on the wall for Lon Nol's regime. Those who were closely identified with it and who could afford to began to get out of the country. Those who were not able to do so were left to fend for themselves, as the military situation became more and more precarious. Waves of poorer refugees began to move away from towns and villages which were threatened by the fighting. And as the Khmer Rouge edged closer to the capital, many of its inhabitants began to join the exodus. Among them, deserters from the government forces who had decided that further resistance would be futile. Some troops, nevertheless, made an attempt to control the exodus. Finally, on the 17th of April, the Khmer Rouge guerrillas, many of them mounted on captured government equipment, rolled into Phnom Penh. The inhabitants greeted their new masters with apparent enthusiasm. At least the long years of war seemed to be ending, and some sort of normality might return. Surely nothing could be worse than what they had already endured. The Khmer Rouge leader, Pol Pot, had been born in a peasant family, but his ability was spotted at a Buddhist monastery school, and he won a scholarship to study in Paris. There he became a communist and adopted the ideas of another Cambodian student, Khieu Samphan. The homeland must be cleansed of Western influence by an agrarian revolution. Cambodia must turn its back on all aspects of capitalist exploitation. Its cities and towns must be destroyed, private property must be confiscated, and its people returned to work on the land. There they would be cut off from any Western influence and re-educated in pure Marxist ideology. Pol Pot adopted these ideas wholeheartedly, along with a deep hatred for all aspects of Western society. For many of his supporters, including Prince Sihanouk, his philosophies were seen as a hazy dream, one which would not stand the test of reality. But they were to be proved terribly wrong, for the day after his forces occupied Phnom Penh, Pol Pot showed that he was grimly in earnest. The name of the country was changed to Kampuchea. Within days, the inhabitants of all towns and cities were evacuated to the countryside, where they had to make themselves makeshift camps. The towns and cities were left eerily deserted. All private property was abolished, and symbols of Western materialism were left to rot. All religions were abolished, and all places of worship were to be destroyed. Out in the countryside, the population was forced to work in the fields for 18 hours a day on minimal rations. The camps became vast killing fields, with the weak dying of malnutrition and brutal treatment. Thousands of others were taken away for execution as class traitors or subversives. For all educated classes, teachers, lawyers, doctors, businessmen, were to be exterminated. There were additional hours of political education designed to weed out these subversive elements and re-educate the rest in this primitive and savage ideology. Families were split up, with the children being taken away for indoctrination while the parents were systematically worked to death. It's impossible to say how many died and how many fled, but the population of Cambodia declined by at least a quarter, the equivalent of some 60 million Americans or 14 million Britons. Interrogation and torture were used systematically to root out enemies, real or imaginary. The ability to speak French was taken to be a sure sign of education and became a death sentence. In the frenzied killing of enemies of the regime, age seemed to be irrelevant. Cambodia was cut off from most of the world while this massive and brutal experiment in social engineering took place. All foreigners, particularly journalists, were banned. Telephone lines were cut. All borders and airports were closed. Only the party elite continued to enjoy some Western technology. But some news of the horrors did get out. Refugees continued to escape from the killing fields and reach camps in neighboring Thailand. An attempt by Britain in 1978 to protest about reported human rights abuses was denounced by the Khmer Rouge as unacceptable interference by a corrupt ex-colonial power. The end of Pol Pot's regime came not through any concerted humanitarian action, but as a result of years of border disputes and skirmishes with Cambodia's neighbors. In December 1978, the Vietnamese tired of Khmer Rouge raids and launched a major offensive into the disputed region. Having destroyed any effective military infrastructure, the Khmer Rouge regime collapsed. Pol Pot and his senior officials fled to China. His followers faded back into the jungle and began a guerrilla war against the invaders. They continued to be as determined as ever to impose their ideology on the inhabitants of the areas which they still controlled. The Vietnamese found themselves the masters of a devastated land and facing widespread international criticism, despite the fact that they had overthrown one of the most murderous regimes ever known. All the infrastructure of a modern society had ceased to exist. and had to be rebuilt from scratch. Steadily, hundreds of thousands of Cambodians began to move back to their former homes. They faced another massive task of rebuilding their shattered lives. Everywhere, evidence of the atrocities which had been committed in pursuit of Pol Pot's dreams was discovered. More than 15 years later, new mass graves were still being found. Even though some international aid began to arrive and the structure of a modern society began to be restored, Cambodia was slow to get back to anything approaching normality. The process of rebuilding was hampered by continuing tension. Pro-Vietnamese puppet government faced opposition both from the Khmer Rouge and an anti-Vietnamese coalition led yet again by Prince Sihanouk. The Vietnamese finally pulled out their forces in 1989. Despite an air of optimism, they left behind a coalition government still fighting the Khmer Rouge. And these guerrillas were still being backed by the Chinese, despite the horrors of their previous regime. In 1993, the United Nations was called in to supervise elections which led to a free and democratically elected government. But it was a government which was still under threat from the men who had caused the Holocaust. For Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge remained active and still enjoying the support of the Chinese. From bases in the jungles along the Thai border, they kept on with their guerrilla war against the elected government in Phnom Penh and its inadequately equipped forces. At least the former allies of Pol Pot, men like Prince Sihanouk, who had thought they could control him, were no longer under any illusions.
I refused categorically to cooperate with the Khmer Rouge. I am now making a plea for an end to the war because my people, they are dying by hunger and the diseases, etc., and the genocide policy of Pol Pot of the Khmer Rouge. They continue to kill, to massacre my people.
Pol Pot attempted to play down the extent of his killing fields. But like the Nazis in Germany, his followers had left too much evidence of their atrocities to be found by their successors. Alongside the appalling mass graves and piles of skulls, the Khmer Rouge kept meticulous records of their activities. In the torture chambers, investigators found daily logs of the regime's handiwork and the equipment which had been used. There were albums with thousands of photographs of those about to be executed. Despite this, international power politics have meant that the man who must rank as one of history's worst mass murderers remains at large. His forces still threaten the fragile peace of Cambodia. The appalling possibility still exists that Pol Pot or his successors may yet be allowed another attempt at building their workers' paradise.